So do you see this as the end of the sort of US hegemony?
Absolutely. If they don't change, they will militarize themselves to death. And I will be the first to mourn it. I really mean it. I'll be the first to mourn it. I've never been anti-American. I've never been anti-West. And it's tragic to see that the West today is only self-destructive. There is no country on earth that wants to invade or control or take the United States or Europe or anywhere else. It is our policies that lead to one defeat after the other, whether it is chips or it is DeepSeek or it is sympathy around the world. If you preside over genocides and wars and mass killings and interventions, and you spend taxpayers' money to such an extent that we will lose welfare in Europe and the United States on it, the rest of the world will turn their back to us. The rest of the world will turn their backs to us. And they will turn to China. China doesn't do anything itself. Everybody who is now sympathetic with China is basically turned away from the West. And so look at the lack of vision in the West. The Chinese knows where they want to be in 40 years from now. They are building this huge Belt and Road Initiative, participating 140 countries around the world, except NATO and European Union. We're building completely new cooperative structures. We are finding synergy. We are finding equal benefits. We're doing the BRICS countries. Economies are booming here and there. Russia today is the fourth largest. It's larger than Japan's economy. Germany, the old locomotive of Europe, has negative growth, and the Chinese will co-produce Volkswagen in Germany in the future. You know, we should see the writing on the wall before it's too late.
On this episode of the Finance Podcast, I have the pleasure of welcoming on Jan Oberg. So Jan is a sociologist, peace researcher, and the director of Transnational Foundation for Peace and Future Research. So Jan, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, looking forward to the conversation. I've listened to quite a few of your interviews, and I just find them really fascinating. You have a unique view, so I wanted to invite you on to talk further about that. And I thought I'd maybe we could start broad. What's happening in the world at the moment? You know, how would you describe the current state of the world as we see it geopolitically?
Well, that's a big one. I would say it's more chaotic than it has been during the 50 years that I have been a researcher, scholar, mediator, etc., in various conflicts around the world. I think the breaking point probably was the end of the first Cold War in 89-90, which the US and NATO exploited to their own favor instead of just saying we move on. And we are not going to dominate the world because now the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact has gone. And so we've had all these interventions, we've had all these wars, which are all unnecessary. Humanity needs to learn how to deal with conflicts with less violence. A conflict is a problem that needs to be solved. And when people take to violence, it's because they don't know how to solve the problem. They don't have the tools, they don't have the education, they don't have the ethics. And therefore, you know, everybody now says in the Western world, whenever there's a problem, go and take a hammer. That will end very badly at some point. Lots of other things, of course, are happening now. To answer your question, the US and the Western world is in decline because of a macro-historical unavoidable change. Empires go up and empires go down. And that is now the turn. The Western Empire, the eastern part of the Western Empire went down, the Soviet Union. And now it's time for the Western part of the Western Empire to go down. They're both Western societies. And up comes, you know, BRICS, China, Asia, Africa, and all the others. And it's a fantastic world we can create in the future if we could learn to cooperate. If we want to dominate, we're going to destroy the world at some point.
Yeah, that's a scary thought, but I'd be interested to start. Yeah, as you mentioned, the end of the Cold War, it seemed like there was two forks. There was the fork where you sort of embrace the former Soviet Union and the States, and then you sort of collaborate. but then it seems like the other path was taken, where it was more of, as you said, domination, looking down on them, trying to continue that divide. Is that sort of what you saw?
Oh yes, very much so. I was in and out of the Soviet Union in the 70s. I talked with scholars. We went to conferences. I mean, at the end of this, there was nothing in the shops. It was a very poor society, and things had broken completely down. And my simple advice at that time, which I would have today in the same situation with anyone, don't exploit somebody who happens to be on his knees. Help him up. If it's a friend, help him up. If it's an enemy, don't exploit the situation, just continue yourself. But to expand NATO, to take advantage of the weakness of Russia, was first of all illegal in the sense that the Western leaders had promised Gorbachev, and that is in writing, that is in thick books, that's in archives, cannot be denied, that NATO would not expand 1 inch if Gorbachev accepted that the two Germanys were united and were united in NATO. So we broke all our promises, and of course, as the present director of CIA, Burns, he was ambassador in Moscow, earlier wrote back when he was an ambassador, the reddest of all red lines is expansion to Ukraine. Everybody who knew anything about security politics, even the basics, and of course also Kissinger and others, warned against ever spreading NATO to Ukraine. And that's where we are today, because we have no intellectuals left. You know, if you looked at Jens Stoltenberg at the time, or Biden or whatever, it's not exactly intellectuals. If you compare them with de Gaulle or Willy Brandt or Adenauer or Olof Palme or Kreisky or Kekkonen, I'm that old, I remember these and I can compare. We are having a bunch of kakistocrats, that is people who are not very well informed about anything and not the best type of people who run the Western world at the moment. And that is dangerous. I'm more afraid of people making decisions in the Western world today than I am over the weapons. And that does not mean that I think we have, with the weapons we should have, we have far too much. We're wasting incredible resources instead of creating a better world. We're wasting incredible resources on militarism. And now Trump and others in NATO are talking about 5% of the gross national product. Now, this is, first of all, a stupid idea, because military expenditures should be tied to a serious threat analysis. It should not go up and down according to whether we have a growing economy or a declining economy. It's a totally bizarre, perverse idea. I'm so far the only one who has criticized that way of measuring what we need for security politics and peace. And that proves my point.
Yeah, definitely. And it does seem like when Biden came in, there was a bit of an ideological shift where it was more like, we're the US, we can do what we want. You have to do what we say, otherwise there's consequences. And then that didn't work very well for the first few years. It created all this conflict, and they sort of stepped back. Is that how you analyze the situation?
Oh, absolutely. I've worked a little bit with ethics, the philosophy of ethics and global ethics versus neighborhood ethics and things like that. And one sign of civilization and wisdom is you do not do everything you potentially could do. Civilization and ethics is about saying we could do it, but we won't do it because it's wrong, because it's counterproductive, because it will hurt too many people or something like that. It's a primitive and banal and evil idea that just because we can do it, we will. And I'm afraid that that's very much what the Americans have done since 45, but particularly after the end of, as I call it, the first Cold War. In the last 30 plus years, 35 years, we've seen leaderships of hubris, of we don't have to listen to anybody, we can do it, we can get away with it. We can be exceptional. We can let Israel do a genocide. We can crush Iraq. We can intervene and bomb and kill leaders. We can split up Yugoslavia. Wisdom would have been to say we can probably do it, but is it wise to do it? The question is no, in all the cases I mentioned.
Yeah, and that's really been, I guess, the last 2 decades. This we can, we will. And it seems like, obviously, I think most people agree the Middle East sort of conflicts in the past 20 years have been a mistake. They've massively indebted the US, 5 or 6 trillion, I think, are the estimates. And there's no change since 20 years ago. The places are worse. So it's and I think that's a lot of the places that
No. And that is, of course, very sad to see, because my attitude is, if you know a little bit about how to analyze a conflict and how to mediate in a conflict and how to work with parties to find a solution, there is not one government, at least not in the West, in NATO, who has any competence in peace. They are all peace and conflict resolution illiterate. They have no advisors. They have no academies for peace. They have no peace ministries. They have no concern for conflict resolution. I mean, I'm sitting in Sweden. I'm a Danish citizen by birth. And the Prime Minister there, Mette Frederiksen, repeatedly say there is nothing to discuss. There's nothing to negotiate. We shall win over Russia through Ukraine. Now, if you have that attitude, you are going to run into a wall, and that wall may be a very unpleasant meeting. But it's intellectually so low a level coming out of illiteracy about conflict resolution and peace that I don't think that such a person qualifies to be a prime minister. Every leader who is in charge of security politics also and foreign policy should have a kind of, I used to call it a driving license. You and I have a driving license because otherwise we cannot drive a car. The reason we have a driving license is to learn something about theory and practice and know what signs mean and how to behave in traffic where there are other people who also have cars and driving licenses. Now, it doesn't take anything to start a war. Anybody can start a fight in a bar. It takes a little intellectual effort. It takes a little theory and concepts. It takes a little human experience and empathy to be able to solve the underlying conflict. And that's where the whole world is going wrong. When we have a war, we have something, violent, like, let's say, Ukraine today. There is a conflict underneath. There is a problem that stands between the parties. It's not that one party is good and the other is bad. It is that they have a problem between them that they cannot solve. And because they can't solve them, they take to violence. They begin to shoot and kill each other. It's an intellectual defeat already. Every war is an intellectual defeat because there's always a way to handle conflicts without violence if we knew how to do it. If we knew these things, were trained in schools for it, had university peace research, which is basically now disappearing in the Western world. The person you talk to is one of the few who is left, educated as a peace researcher, knows a little bit about peace theories and nonviolence and things like that. That is the reason we have all these wars. It's not human evil, it's human stupidity. It's human lack of education, it's human illiteracy. And that I see is a big thing to do in the future of the world. The future world, and that's the reason I keep on doing this, because, with my colleagues, and we've done it since 1986 in this foundation, we believe in the UN Charter's Article 1. And what does that say? Every government has signed it. Article 1 of the UN Charter says that peace shall be established by peaceful means. So they are all violating this. The only country today who puts, important country, world leading country, if you will, that puts peace very high up and into the constitution and built it into peaceful coexistence and 5 principles is China. The West should learn a little bit from China. I don't say we should love China. I'm saying you should learn a little bit from China. They are wise on these points than we are or have ever been.
Yeah, it does seem like the West is sort of, there's no potential for compromise. That's, if you think about a negotiation, there's normally a little bit, it has to be a little bit give on both sides. But if there's no give on one, then there's, you're not giving options for the other side.
Exactly. I mean, killing somebody just adds another problem on top of the problem. Let's say you and I have a conflict about something, money or whatever, territory or whatever it is. We could talk about da 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 da. If I begin to kill your children, we have a problem that is much more serious. And that's typical for, conflicts like the one in Palestine, Israel, etc. We have forgotten what it was all about in the bottom, in the history, lower down. And we look at this tit for tat. I shoot your children, you shoot my children. And then comes what Johan Galtung, my mentor in peace research, who died a year ago, always said that most people take out their traumas with an interest. I put my trauma into the trauma bank 30 years ago, and I take it out now. So if you kill 10 with me, I kill 100 with you. You know, it's an incredibly sad, tragic part of human civilization that, in that sense, we've not come down from the trees yet. That it's statesmanship to run wars. It's not statesmanship to make peace. And that's where I think we all have something to learn. In all humility, I think there's something to learn from most people who run the world.
Yeah, and maybe if I sort of push back a little in terms of NATO, so say, they're a defensive pact, and if a state wants to join them, should another stronger state prevent them from joining? And then I guess as well, China's sort of, there's issues in Tibet, there's issues in other parts of the country, as well as, the Taiwan question. So I guess is it really the way to look at it from, some other countries are doing better than the West?
Well, I'm not an expert in any way on Tibet, but I've studied Taiwan a little bit. I've not been there, but I've been to China many times since 1983 when I was there the first time. And you should be aware, and I want your viewers to be aware, that the United States and the West have nothing to do in Taiwan, according to agreements signed between Nixon and Zhou Enlai. When they met, facilitated by, among others, Chas Freeman and Kissinger, they made a huge declaration, and point 12 of that, if I remember correctly, says that the United States considers that Taiwan is inhabited by Chinese like the mainland. We will not interfere in any way in Taiwan, and it's up to China to find out what to do and how to do it. The fact that the Western world, the US in particular, has armed Taiwan is totally in a total systematic violation for 50 years of that treaty between China and the United States. That is never mentioned in Western media. The Western media are lying about the status of Taiwan. And they are lying about Xinjiang and the genocide in Xinjiang. I've just been to Xinjiang in September last year. I have a little bit of a different idea about what this is all about, but that is too long to get into here. I have written 2 long articles on transnational.live about what I think. But we recognize not that the Chinese had a terrorist problem in Xinjiang with a tiny, tiny bit of the Uyghurs, and they have all the support from the Western world. They want an independent state. They want to carve out Xinjiang, the largest province of China, from China, and thereby destroy the new Silk Roads. And they have the full support of the West, and the exile government of those terrorists are sitting in Washington. There's a little bit of information that the Western media are totally ignorant about, or steered or orchestrated to never mention. And that puts the whole thing in a different light. But that's a long story. There are more details to it. I'm just hinting. We are being filled with lies and deceptions and stories that are not true. Now, I don't think it's a strong person who has to lie, and I don't think it's a strong country anymore who has to lie as much as the United States does. There were nuclear weapons in Saddam's Iraq, right? Milosevic was a new Hitler, right? One of the things that really bothers me and is mind-boggling to me is that so many good-hearted, well-educated people in the West still believe what they read in the media and hear on the television primetime news in the evenings. But they will have their Pravda moment. Pravda, called Truth, the Russian Soviet newspaper. At the time when the Soviet people found out that they had been lied to for years, the whole thing fell apart. That's where we are. The moment we are approaching in the western part of the Western Empire. Sorry to say so, but that's what I believe. I know a little bit about certain places, and I've never seen a similarity between the media reporting of that place and the place I was at. Ask anybody who worked in Bosnia from the UN or OSCE at the time in the 90s. When they came home for Christmas for holidays and looked at their local newspapers and said, "What? Is this about the place I've spent the last 2 or 3 years in as a peacekeeper? I don't recognize anything." I can say the same.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. But I guess if I go back to Taiwan, if the US hadn't armed them, and if they hadn't, there's sort of like a protection pact, or it's hard to tell what it actually is. But I think that's sort of what people imply. Would China have then invaded the country?
Of course
And
not.
I guess,
Of
yeah,
course not.
no.
Of course not. There's no idea that China will invade this place. But if the US keeps on arming it, it may happen because everybody has a limit. Please think of the idea. I know it's not completely parallel or a 100% good analogy. Please think of what would happen if for 30, 40 years, China had armed Hawaii, which was an occupation, to become an independent state out of the US. Think of it if Chinese ships permanently built bases around the US and patrolled the waters outside Florida and California. Just try sometimes to use your imagination and see how would the West react to these things. I can tell you one more thing. If the Americans had been placed physically or geographically where Russia is today, and Mr. Trump had been sitting in Moscow, or Mr. Biden had been running Moscow, they would have invaded all of and taken all of Ukraine long ago. They would never have accepted a unfriendly alliance next to its border with long-range missiles that in 2 or 3 minutes can destroy Moscow. Of course not. What we are demanding of the Russians is something we would never accept ourselves. Look at the Cuba missile crisis at the time. The US would not have Russian rockets or missiles at Cuba. Why do we expect that Russia, who warned against this, you can say much about Putin, but he is very low-key, warned about this since 2007, if not earlier. And both Gorbachev and who was the name of the guy who came after, who was drinking, protested wildly against NATO's expansion. Nobody listened. Now, why don't we listen to the Russians? We expect them to listen to us. Just have empathy and equal demands, equal requests, and equal benefits. It's so simple. I'm sometimes ashamed that I'm saying so simple things.
Yeah, and I guess that links back to the NATO question about while it's a defensive pact, it does push the territory. It's close to pushing the line closer and closer to Russia. And as you said, there's a lot of the times missiles and other weapons on those borders. So that's the issue of it expanding despite it being defensive.
Yeah, I warned against it too. Anybody who knew anything about it would do that. But long story short, a couple of problems with NATO. NATO's treaty is defensive. I would personally sign it anytime. We are a group of countries who will come to each other's help and rescue if we are attacked by somebody from outside. That's a totally defensive thinking. But what NATO does 24/7 today is to violate its own charter. And somebody should investigate how long time an organization can violate systematically in everything it does its own foundation. And that began with the bombing of Yugoslavia. NATO has nothing to do had nothing to do in Yugoslavia, and it has nothing to do in Ukraine. It's not a member of the alliance. It has no member has been attacked. And so you can go on like this. Secondly, NATO is built on the absolutely counterproductive idea of deterrence. To put it crudely, deterrence mean that I say to you, we can talk, but I point a pistol at your brain. Deterrence means I can kill you on your territory. And thereby, I want you to understand you should not do something I don't like you to do, or you should do what I tell you to do. Now, that is not defensiveness. You can say you have defensive intentions, but if you can kill people 5,000 kilometers away, you have a planning for being able to kill people offensively. And the third thing is that the only answer NATO has, and I consider it a kind of church and congregation today because there's nobody who has any analysis anymore. Go through everything on the homepage of NATO. There's not a single intellectual input or theoretical discussion about these things. That problem is, and no matter what the problem is, we we say armament, rearmament, more weapons. Now, if weapons could make peace, we would have had peace long ago. If NATO could make peace, we would not be in the situation where we are in today. And so the whole intellectual, theoretical, conceptual construction of NATO is bonkers. It's intellectually lousy. There's no way in which it can serve anybody else but the military, industrial, media, academic complex, MIMAC. It cannot serve peace. And if you want a proof, just look at Europe today. So the long story short is it's not a defensive alliance except on paper or in its treaty. And that treaty is good. And you know, it also says that all conflicts should be transferred to the United Nations. So when did Mr. Stoltenberg at the time, when did he transfer the Ukraine question to the Security Council and the General Assembly? He did not. He violated systematically the NATO treaty. Very few people have read it. Very few people have read the UN Charter. I recommend all your viewers to read those two documents and you'll be shocked. I mean, shocked about the discrepancy between the norms and the values built into it and what actually is done in NATO. And you'll be shocked that we have such an incredibly fine, I would say the most Gandhian document countries and nations, governments have ever signed in the United Nations Charter. And the United Nations, the finest organization humanity has. I know it needs reforms, that's not my point. My point is it's the finest piece of paper of how we should live together on this earth, and nobody refers to it. Why the hell have nobody talked about peacekeeping troops in Ukraine? Why are we not talking about stopping a genocide, which we are morally and legally obliged to do? Not only to punish it, we are obliged, according to international law, to prevent a genocide. Who can do that? Decent countries, moral countries, if we have some, by means of the United Nations. There is no other who can do it. I mean, I'm quite sure you can see the difference between that and Mr. Trump saying that he wants to buy Gaza. And, you know, I call it Las Vegas. He wants to carry, his primitive idea is that he wants to turn Gaza into a kind of casino in Las Vegas. And it's a real estate problem, right? And then it cleansed 2 million people out of the place, and he just said yesterday, and they're not going to come back at any point. You know, we are into a completely absurd world. Ionesco and Beckett could not have written it more absurdly than where we are today with that leadership of the United States.
Yeah, so where do you see the trajectory going?
The United States could adapt to the world and become one of us. We would all love it. I have never been anti-American. I've grown up in an Americanized culture in Sweden and Denmark. I love Bob Dylan, Robert Rauschenberg, and everything else the United States has created and given the world. But it cannot survive if it wants to dominate the rest. It's a stupid Christian idea that we are on top. We're number first world over the second world, over the third world, over the fourth world. And they must all accept that we rule them and that they will come up sooner or later and be like us. The fine thing is we should not be like anybody else. We should be ourselves. And the Chinese are not going to build an empire because they don't have the mission idea. They have no wish to turn every other country into by a Bible or a sword. They have no wish to turn other countries into communist countries or mixed economies or Confucianist thinkers or something like that. I mean, it's an outrageously stupid idea the West has had, whether the British or Rome or the United States today, or the United States and Europe, that we have a kind of God-given right. We are the chosen people to go out and tell others how they should live. Let's stop that. It's very easy. Stop that idea. We're not at higher level than anybody else. And by the way, cultural values, norms, history cannot be compared. It's apples and pears, you know. Become like the others. Become a partner instead of dominator. And you can create a fantastic West. Then we can rebuild the infrastructure of the United States. Then we can get away with the 30% of the people in the United States who live under the poverty line. Then we could stop the armament. Then there would be much less war. all the things, that I mention here comes from wanting to dominate somebody else and others who don't want to be dominated. I mean, again, I'm ashamed I'm saying such banal things, but it has to be said. Somebody has to say it, and I can say it because nobody's paying me. I'm not in the hands of any corporations. Our foundation is not, and our foundation is not in the hands of any government. We are people financed, and all of us, 50 people around the world, are volunteers. And that means we can say what we want. We are the last free research place, if you will, and public education place, whereas state institutes get millions of dollars and say nothing interesting.
Yeah, it seems to be more obvious with the recent, I don't know if you've been watching in the US, how all these institutions are being funded by the US government, basically, all these NGOs and other.
Just look at it. You will see how the think tanks are financed by State Department and Pentagon around the world. And around the world also by the USAID, the color revolutions and all that. Money, 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 money. Free yourself from money. Gandhi did not. He could not be bought. Some of us cannot be bought. But I would love to see America change the style and become the wonderful country it could be. Full of dynamics, full of resources, and it can live without Greenland. I tell you, it can live without Greenland. It can live without Canada. If it could stop dominating the rest of it needs all these resources. Trump is saying it again, we need Greenland because of national security and economic security. For what? Because you want to dominate the world. If you want to be a partner of the world, you don't need that.
So do you see this as the end of the sort of US hegemony?
Absolutely. If they don't change, they will militarize themselves to death. And I will be the first to mourn it. I really mean it. I'll be the first to mourn it. I've never been anti-American. I've never been anti-West. And it's tragic to see that the West today is only self-destructive. There is no country on earth that wants to invade or control or take the United States or Europe or anywhere else. It is our policies that lead to one defeat after the other, whether it is chips or it is DeepSeek or it is sympathy around the world. If you preside over genocides and wars and mass killings and interventions, and you spend taxpayers' money to such an extent that we will lose welfare in Europe and the United States on it, the rest of the world will turn their back to us. The rest of the world will turn their backs to us. And they will turn to China. China doesn't do anything itself. Everybody who is now sympathetic with China is basically turned away from the West. And so look at the lack of vision in the West. The Chinese knows where they want to be in 40 years from now. They are building this huge Belt and Road initiative, participating 140 countries around the world, except NATO and European Union. We're building completely new cooperative structures. We are finding synergy. We are finding equal benefits. We're doing the BRICS countries. Economies are booming here and there. Russia today is the fourth largest. It's larger than Japan's economy. Germany, the old locomotive of Europe, has negative growth, and the Chinese will co-produce Volkswagen in Germany in the future. We should see the writing on the wall before it's too late. But the overall trend is all empires go down. There's no empire that has lasted forever. The only question I have in my mind is, how will this empire go down? And that's not an easy question to answer. I don't have an answer, but I can fear how it will go down. When the Eastern Brother fell apart, it was Gorbachev who was in charge of it, or spearheading it. He was a moral man. He was a visionary. He was a humanist. And he had the idea that, okay, my system is over, but I can do something new with it. And I want a European house where we can discuss peace and security and live in peace together. I mean, he had a vision. That vision was destroyed by the West, but he had a vision. He was a good man, knowing also that his own system was defunct. I'm not sure we have anybody, or rather, I'm sure at the moment we don't have anybody like Gorbachev in the Western world, who could go down with grace, go down with decency, and seek cooperation with others. I don't see that in Mr. Trump. I didn't see it in Mr. Biden, and I don't know who comes afterwards. But I don't see the West saying we want cooperation. They say we are exceptionalist. We can do what others cannot do. We can get away with all kinds of crimes. And we don't care about how others look at us. We are just so big and strong and great. I think that'll come to an end rather soon.
And you think that's why maybe BRICS is, it's driven other countries to want to collaborate with BRICS because they're looking for another option,
Yeah, but that's part of it. The other part of it is it's a natural development that something new comes up.
Yeah, okay. So as you said, there's always empires always fall and there's always something that comes to replace it. So do you see it becoming a multipolar world, or you think it's going to just shift to sort of the east?
Well, the economy has already shifted to the east. Much of the political dynamics and new thinking comes in the east, and not only China, but all other countries and BRICS countries. But the challenge, to put it very crudely and popularly, is for the West is, if you can't beat them, join them. And that is what I think they should do, because we need synergy, and that is from a much bigger perspective. What I think we should remember is the huge problems humanity is facing. Everybody would say climate change, global heating, or whatever we call it, global warming, poverty, reduction of violence, structural violence, military direct violence, gender violence, cultural violence. I would say probably a bigger issue than climate change. But one can discuss it. What I'm saying is humanity, all of us are facing some big, big challenges for which we do not have unlimited time to find solutions. Now, if we keep on wasting our resources, our brains, our talents, our technicians on warfare, we will lose. We will lose, because you don't win the world's game and you don't save humanity by making militarism your priority. You can only do that if you have a civil vision of a better world for us all. And if the US keeps on doing what it does at the moment, together with NATO and Europe, because Europe has no independence in these areas from the US, we will lose. But if we could gain strength and synergy, we can solve these problems together that humanity is standing. We can create a fantastic world. I'm not saying beautiful world, because the word beautiful you cannot use anymore, because Mr. Trump is using that word about something that is actually ugly. But I think we can still create a beautiful world, a peaceful world, a development world, a human rights world, a world where everybody has a chance. I'm totally convinced. I would not do what I do 24/7 with my colleagues in the Transnational Foundation if I did not deeply believe in that. But this present situation is, of course, not what I had hoped when I was a student educating myself in peace and conflict studies and global studies.
So Jan, thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate the conversation. And my last question is, what is one message you want people to take away from our conversation?
Well, in that case, two things. One really banal, peace is better than war. And we should remember what George Bernard Shaw allegedly has said. Most people look at the world as it is and ask why. What we should look at is how the world could be and ask why not. And that leads me to give you just a little very important distinction. And that's between negative peace and positive peace. Negative peace is when there's no war, when there's no violence used, when things are, it's like, not being ill. But positive peace, that is conviviality, that is development, that is challenges, that's vision, that is the idea that the world can become a better place and we work together for it. Like positive health is not just not to be ill or have cancer or fever, but it is to feel convivial. It is to feel, yes, life is wonderful, and I'm full of creativity. I can do things, I can create things, this kind of surplus energy. I'm totally convinced that that is what that thinking of positive peace as realization of the world's and humanity's potential is possible. But you can't do it with those mechanisms that are now dominating in the Western world. So I hope that what I've said is a loving observation of the West's disease called militarism, and that we can stand together and do something about it before it's too late. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about these, I think, rather important things.
Thank you so much for coming on. As you said, it's extremely important. So I'm glad we could have this conversation and hopefully share it to more people. But yeah, Jan, thanks again. If anyone wanted to find out more about your work, I'm guessing transnational.live would be the place to find it.
Yes, that's where you begin. There are other places, but that's where you go.
Great. I'll put in the description below, but thanks again for your time.
Thank you so much.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening. I really appreciate the support. If you've got value out of this, I'd really appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, or comment, good or bad feedback. I'm always open to that, but it really helps with the channel. As I said before, only about 14% of people actually subscribe to this channel. So if you were to that, it would really help. It could mean we could continue to grow. If not, thanks for watching and see you on the next show. And you also might like this video right here. All right, thanks again.